Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who changed Egypt forever for nearly 3,000 years, the gods of Egypt ruled not only the heavens, but also the hearts of its people. The mighty sun god Ra, the falcon-headed Horus, the mother goddess Isis, and the deathless Osiris. A vast pantheon, dozens, perhaps even hundreds of divine beings, each responsible for some part of life, death, and eternity. Every village had its shrine. Every city had its patron deity. And above all, the sprawling temples of Amun at Thebes rose like mountains of stone, tended by priests whose wealth rivaled kings. For the Egyptians, religion wasn't just belief. It was the air they breathed, the rhythm of their daily lives, the glue that held their civilization together. But then, something happened. Something unthinkable. In the 14th century BC, one man dared to defy it all. A pharaoh who looked upon the gods of Egypt, gods who had been worshipped for centuries, and declared them unnecessary. His name was Amenhotep IV. But history would remember him as Akhenaten. He proclaimed that there was only one god worth worshipping, not Amun, not Osiris, not Ra in his traditional form, but Aten, the radiant disk of the sun. It was a bold, dangerous vision, one that challenged the very foundations of Egypt's power. Temples closed. Priests were stripped of influence. The gods themselves, erased from monuments. And in their place, Aten shone alone. To some, Akhenaten was a visionary, perhaps even the world's first monotheist. To others, he was a madman, a reckless dreamer who nearly tore Egypt apart. This is the story of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. The man who tried to change Egypt forever. Section 1, the man before the revolution, before he became the heretic, before he defied Egypt's gods. Akhenaten was known as Amenhotep IV. Born into luxury, destined for greatness, yet overshadowed by a legacy that would weigh heavily on his shoulders. He was the son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most successful rulers. Amenhotep III presided over an empire at its peak, vast, wealthy, and powerful. His reign was marked by prosperity, diplomacy, and monumental building projects. The temples at Luxor, the grand palace at Malkata, the towering colossi of Memnon, all stood as testaments to his glory. By the time young Amenhotep IV came of age, Egypt was the jewel of the ancient world. Its influence stretched from Nubia in the south to the lands of Syria in the north. The wealth of conquered territories poured into the Nile Valley. Egypt's priests grew richer, Egypt's temples grew larger, and Egypt's gods were worshipped with more devotion than ever before. But within this glittering world, cracks had already begun to form. The priesthood of Amun, centered in Thebes, had amassed staggering power. They controlled land, resources, and a fortune that rivaled, some whispered, even surpassed, that of the pharaoh himself. While Amenhotep III managed to keep their influence in check, the balance between throne and temple was delicate. His son would inherit not only the crown, but this fragile struggle for power. And what of the man himself? Very little survives to give us a clear image of Amenhotep IV's early life. Unlike other princes, who often appear in carvings and inscriptions, he is strangely absent from the record. No heroic scenes of him hunting lions. No triumphant depictions of him as a warrior. It is as though he lived in the shadow, invisible, until his moment arrived. What we do know is that he was married to one of history's most famous queens, Nefertiti. Together, they would form one of ancient Egypt's most enigmatic royal partnerships. She was not merely a consort, but an active participant in his religious revolution, often depicted alongside him in ways no queen had been shown before. When Amenhotep III died around 1353 BCE, the young prince ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV. He inherited an empire of immense wealth and power, but also a religious system dominated by entrenched priesthoods. A system that left little room for innovation, and even less room for a king who sought to place himself at the center of worship. And so, at first, he did what every new pharaoh was expected to do: honor tradition. He built temples to Amun, made offerings to the gods, and presented himself as the rightful successor of a divine line stretching back centuries. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. Even in these early years, Amenhotep IV's attention seemed fixed on a different power. A god not of hidden temples or secret rites, but of the open sky? A radiant force, simple and universal, the sun itself. This obsession would soon transform him, and Egypt, forever. Section 2, The Rise of Aten. At first, Amenhotep IV followed tradition. He honored the gods of Egypt, built shrines in their names, and bowed before Amun, king of the gods. But even in these early years, something unusual appeared in his offerings. Alongside the great deities of Thebes, he consistently favored one divine presence above all others: Aten, the shining disk of the sun. Now, Aten was not an invention of Amenhotep IV. The god had existed before, worshipped in small ways during earlier dynasties. But Aten had always been a minor aspect of Ra, not a supreme being. A circle of light with rays extending down, often ending in tiny hands that offered life to the pharaoh and his family. But for Amenhotep IV, Aten was more than a symbol. He was everything. In the 4th year of his reign, the young pharaoh made his first bold move. He began constructing vast temples to Aten, not hidden in shadow, but open to the blazing sun. Unlike traditional temples, where the gods resided in dark sanctuaries and were tended by priests, Aten's temples had no roofs, no chambers, no secrecy. They were open courtyards, flooded with light, as though the god himself was always present, always visible. This was a radical break with centuries of religious tradition. The Egyptians had always believed their gods dwelled in mystery, hidden away in sanctuaries where only priests could approach them. But Aten needed no gatekeepers. His power shone openly, freely, for all to see. And with this change, something else happened. The role of pharaoh itself began to transform. For in Aten's worship, there was no priesthood, no sprawling hierarchy of temple officials. The only true intermediary between Aten and the people was the king. In murals and carvings, Aten's rays stretch down from the sky, but they do not touch the hands of common Egyptians, nor even priests. Instead, they end in blessings only upon Akhenaten and Nefertiti. It was through them, and only them, that Aten's divine power reached Egypt. This was more than a new religion. It was a new order of power. By elevating Aten above all other gods, Amenhotep IV was stripping authority away from the priests of Amun, centralizing it instead in his own person and his queen. But the pharaoh's devotion went even further. In year 5 of his reign, he did something unthinkable: he changed his name. No longer Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied. He became Akhenaten, servant of Aten. With that single act, he publicly declared his allegiance. Not to Amun, not to the countless gods of Egypt, but to Aten alone. And to ensure that his revolution could not be undone by the shadow of the old gods, he prepared for his boldest move yet, abandoning Thebes, the city of Amun, and building an entirely new capital from the sands of the desert. A city dedicated to Aten, and to Akhenaten himself. Section 3, The Religious Revolution. By the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaten's devotion to Aten was no longer just a personal preference, it had become a political mission. And that mission would transform Egypt like never before. The pharaoh made his most audacious move. He abandoned Thebes, the ancient seat of Amun's power, and ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city. Its name was Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of Aten. Today, it is known as Amarna. This city was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. It rose swiftly from the desert sands, built at breakneck speed. Not a slow evolution of temples and palaces like Thebes, but an instant capital designed for one purpose, to glorify Aten and to serve as the beating heart of the new faith. At the center of Amarna stood vast open-air temples to Aten. Unlike the dark sanctuaries of Amun, these temples had no hidden chambers. Sunlight poured into their courtyards. Altars stood under the open sky. Worshippers stood not in shadow, but in blazing daylight. The very architecture proclaimed a new truth: Aten was not a distant god of mysteries, but a living presence shining above all. And at the heart of these rituals stood Akhenaten and Nefertiti. In carvings, we see them offering gifts to Aten: bread, beer, flowers, while the sun's rays stretch down, ending in tiny hands that bless the royal couple. Common Egyptians are absent from these scenes. Priests are nowhere to be seen. This was a religion of one god and one ruler. It was, in essence, the world's first step toward monotheism. But it was also deeply radical. Akhenaten didn't simply elevate Aten, he suppressed the old gods. The name of Amun was chiseled out of monuments across Egypt. Inscriptions were altered. Temples to traditional deities fell into neglect. It was a religious purge, a sweeping attempt to erase the gods who had defined Egyptian identity for nearly 2,000 years. To his followers, Akhenaten proclaimed a bold new truth: Aten was the only true god, giver of life, source of creation, shining for all humanity. To his enemies, he was a heretic, dismantling Egypt's traditions, angering the gods, and weakening the very fabric of society. And yet, within Amarna's sunlit courtyards, there was a sense of idealism. Art from this period reveals something never seen before in Egyptian history. Instead of stiff, idealized images, we see the royal family depicted in intimate, human moments. Akhenaten cradling his daughters. Nefertiti kissing one of her children. The pharaoh himself shown with elongated features, almost androgynous, his belly rounded, his face soft and strange. To some, these images reflect a new vision of kingship, not a distant warrior god, but a father, a husband, a servant of the one true Aten. To others, there were signs of eccentricity, even deformity. Whatever the case, this was a cultural revolution as well as a religious one. In art, in worship, in the very foundations of society, Akhenaten was remaking Egypt in his own image. But revolutions, by their nature, create tension. The priests of Amun seethed in silence. The people of Egypt, who had worshipped their many gods for centuries, quietly questioned this new order. And as Akhenaten grew more zealous, his grip on tradition, and on his empire, began to slip. The heretic pharaoh had reshaped Egypt's soul. But at what cost? Section 4, The New Capital, Amarna. When Akhenaten decided to abandon Thebes, it was not a small gesture. It was a declaration of war on the old order. Thebes was the sacred home of Amun, the seat of his priests, and the political heart of Egypt for centuries. By turning his back on it, Akhenaten was sending a clear message: the age of Amun was over. He chose a stretch of desert halfway between Memphis and Thebes, a place unclaimed by any god, untouched by tradition. Here, with astonishing speed, he ordered the construction of an entirely new capital, Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten. What rose from the sands was breathtaking. a city of wide avenues and open courtyards, where sunlight dominated every space. The central axis of Amarna led directly to the great temple of Aten, an enormous complex with no roof to block the sky. Rows of offering tables stretched out in the open air, constantly laden with food, flowers, and libations for the ever-present sun. The royal palace, too, was unlike anything seen before. It was not a fortress of stone, but a sprawling compound with windows and colonnades that let in streams of light. Frescoes decorated the walls, painted not with solemn gods but with lively, almost tender images, the royal daughters playing, Nefertiti radiant in her crown, Akhenaten raising his hands to the shining Aten above. Everywhere, the same motif repeated, the sun disk, Aten, with its rays ending in tiny hands, bestowing life directly upon the royal family. It was a constant reminder, all blessings, all power, flowed through Aten. And through Akhenaten and Nefertiti. But Amarna was more than temples and palaces. It was a living experiment in society itself. Craftsmen and workers were brought in from across Egypt to build the city, and many stayed to live there. Archaeologists have uncovered entire neighborhoods, revealing houses, workshops, and even cemeteries of the ordinary people who once called Amarna home. Yet their lives were not easy. The remains show signs of hard labor, malnutrition, even broken bones from carrying heavy loads. For the common people, Amarna was not a paradise of sunlight, it was a place of backbreaking toil, built at the pace of a pharaoh's obsession. And despite its splendor, Amarna was fragile. It lacked the sacred traditions that anchored Thebes. It was isolated, cut off from the great religious centers and ancestral gods of Egypt. The priests of Amun did not follow. Many ordinary Egyptians remained deeply uneasy, still whispering prayers to Osiris, Isis, and Amun in private, even as Akhenaten demanded loyalty to Aten alone. In the glittering temples and palaces, the vision seemed strong, a radiant new world devoted to one god. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Amarna was a city born of ideology, not necessity. It was sustained by the will of Akhenaten, and his will alone. And the wider empire, the lands of Nubia, Syria, and beyond, was beginning to feel neglected. Foreign leaders wrote desperate letters to Egypt, pleading for troops and gold. While Akhenaten built his city of the sun, Egypt's influence abroad began to dim. Amarna stood as a shining symbol of Akhenaten's dream. But it was also a fragile bubble, one that could burst the moment the sun set on his reign. Section 5, Art and Family, a Different Pharaoh. In the world of ancient Egypt, pharaohs were usually depicted as larger-than-life, warriors, gods in human form, eternally youthful, strong, and perfect. But Akhenaten broke this rule too. The art of the Amarna period is unlike anything Egypt had ever produced before, or since. Instead of rigid poses and idealized bodies, Akhenaten's artists portrayed him with elongated limbs, a thin neck, wide hips and a soft, protruding belly. His face is narrow, with heavy lips and almond-shaped eyes. It was a shocking departure. To some, he looked almost androgynous, not quite male, not quite female. Some scholars believe this was deliberate, a visual way to show that Akhenaten embodied both masculine and feminine qualities, just as the god Aten encompassed all of creation. Others argue that perhaps the pharaoh suffered from a genetic disorder that shaped his appearance. Whatever the truth, the message was clear: Akhenaten was not bound by tradition. He was different, and he wanted the world to see it. But it wasn't only Akhenaten who appeared differently in art. His queen, Nefertiti, emerged as a central figure in ways no Egyptian queen ever had before. She is shown nearly as large as the pharaoh himself, often participating in religious rituals, side by side with him. In some scenes, it is Nefertiti, not Akhenaten, who offers to Aten, suggesting she was his equal in both devotion and power. And then there was their family. For the first time in Egyptian history, we see tender, intimate moments carved into stone. Akhenaten and Nefertiti playing with their 6 daughters. The girls climbing onto their laps, reaching up to touch their parents' faces, even tugging at their crowns. The rays of Aten stretch down over the family, ending in little hands that bless not just the pharaoh, but his wife and children as well. It is a startlingly human vision of royalty. Pharaohs of the past were often shown smiting enemies, or presenting offerings to the gods. But here, in the bright courtyards of Amarna, the royal family laughed, kissed, embraced, all under the watchful eye of the Aten. This artistic revolution did more than change how Egypt's rulers were depicted. It changed the very meaning of kingship. Akhenaten was not simply the distant, divine ruler. He was the chosen prophet of Aten, living proof of the sun's blessing, the father of a sacred family through which life itself flowed. But while the art of Amarna spoke of intimacy, warmth, and divine favor, outside the city walls, Egypt was growing restless. For ordinary people, the sun disk offered little comfort compared to the gods they had worshipped for generations. And for the priests and soldiers who had once thrived under Egypt's powerful traditions, Akhenaten's vision was beginning to feel like a dangerous experiment. The pharaoh had remade Egypt's art, family, and religion in his own image. But the price of breaking tradition was growing heavier by the day. Section 6: Backlash and Troubles. For a time, Amarna shone brightly. The temples bustled with offerings, the royal family basked under the rays of Aten, and the city seemed to radiate Akhenaten's vision of a new world. But outside its sunlit walls, storm clouds were gathering. The people of Egypt had not forgotten their old gods. Farmers still whispered prayers to Osiris for a good harvest. Sailors still called upon Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile, for protection on the water. Mothers still prayed to Taweret, the hippo goddess, for safe childbirth. Aten might dominate the temples, but in the hearts of the people, the old gods lived on. The most dangerous opposition, however, came not from ordinary Egyptians but from the priests of Amun. For centuries, the cult of Amun had grown wealthy and powerful, controlling vast estates, armies of workers, and enormous influence in Thebes. Akhenaten's decree stripped them of their authority, closed their temples, and redirected their wealth to Aten. They did not forget, and they did not forgive. At the same time, Egypt's international position was weakening. Across the empire, from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, vassal states wrote desperate letters to the pharaoh, begging for help. Enemies were attacking, borders were threatened, and rivals were seizing land. But Akhenaten seemed indifferent. His attention was fixed on religious matters, on Aten, on his dreamed city. Foreign leaders grew frustrated, allies abandoned Egypt, and enemies grew bolder. Inside Amarna itself, life was not as radiant as the official art suggested. Archaeological evidence shows that workers suffered from malnutrition and relentless labor. Children's skeletons reveal signs of stunted growth. This was a city built in haste, sustained by ideology, not prosperity. And perhaps most ominously, the royal family began to face tragedy. Several of Akhenaten's daughters died young, their small tombs discovered in Amarna's cemeteries. Grief weighed heavily on the pharaoh and Nefertiti, and whispers began to spread, was Aten truly a life-giving god if even the royal children were not spared? By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, cracks were everywhere. The empire abroad was crumbling. At home, resentment simmered. Even within the palace, tensions grew. Nefertiti, once depicted constantly at Akhenaten's side, seems to vanish from the record in the final years. Some scholars suggest she may have died, others that she took on a new identity, perhaps even ruling in her own right. And then came the greatest blow, Akhenaten himself began to fade. Whether through illness, stress, or simple exhaustion, the once radical pharaoh could not hold his world together forever. His Atenist revolution, so bold and so absolute, was beginning to look fragile. Egypt had endured countless pharaohs and countless changes. But Akhenaten's refusal to bend, his obsession with one god, and his neglect of the empire left his vision vulnerable. The backlash was not only inevitable, it was already underway. Section 7, the death of a heretic sometime around 1336 BCE, after 17 years on the throne, Akhenaten's reign came to an end. The exact circumstances of his death remain a mystery. Some believe he succumbed to illness, perhaps worsened by the stress of leading an unpopular religious revolution. Others whisper of intrigue, of betrayal within his own court. But whatever the cause, one fact is certain: the heretic pharaoh died before he could secure his vision of Aten's eternal kingdom. What followed was chaos. Akhenaten left behind no strong heir. His daughters were too young to rule, and his sons, if he had any, were not recognized. For a brief moment, Egypt may have been ruled by a mysterious figure known as Smenkare, possibly a son-in-law or even Nefertiti herself under a new name. The historical record is frustratingly unclear, clouded in secrecy and erasure. Eventually, a young boy took the throne, a boy who would become one of the most famous pharaohs in history, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun had been born Tutankhaten, literally the living image of Aten. But under the influence of advisors and priests, his name was changed, linking him once more to the old gods, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The restoration had begun. The great temples of Amun were reopened. The wealth and power of the priesthood returned. The traditional gods, silenced for nearly 2 decades, were welcomed back with open arms. Aten, once the sole ruler of the heavens, was reduced to little more than a footnote. And as for Akhenaten himself, the backlash against him was swift and brutal. His city of Amarna was abandoned, left to crumble in the desert sun. His monuments were torn down, his statues smashed, his name chiseled out from inscriptions. To later generations of Egyptians, he was not a visionary but a criminal against the gods. The ancient Egyptians practiced something even more powerful than execution, damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory. Akhenaten's enemies did not just destroy his works. They sought to erase him from history itself, as though he had never lived, as though his revolution had never happened. For nearly 3,000 years, their plan worked. When archaeologists rediscovered the ruins of Amarna in the 19th century, the world was stunned. Here was an entire forgotten city, a chapter of Egyptian history buried and erased, the legacy of the pharaoh who dared to challenge the gods. Akhenaten had tried to change Egypt forever. But in the end, Egypt changed him, casting him into shadow, branding him not as a prophet, but as a heretic. So next time you look at the desert sands, or the ruins of a temple bathed in sunlight, remember Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who dared to follow a single ray of light and, for a moment, illuminated all of Egypt. If you enjoyed this documentary, please don't forget like and subscribe, because history is not only shaped by those who succeed. It is also defined by those who dare to dream differently.